Things have finally started to die down a bit again in the NHL as far as news is concerned, so it's time to get back to some more NHL 101 and some of the basics for you newer fans. And today we're talking about the basics of penalties. Now, when it comes to penalties in the NHL, there is plenty to cover as things do work somewhat differently in hockey than they do in most other sports. So this is going to be more of a series of videos, and in this one, we're not going to be so much talking about specific penalties and more the different types of penalties that can get called and can get guys sent to that glass case of emotion known as the penalty box. Of course, if you were just starting to kind of get into hockey over this last season in particular, you may be aware that there was all sorts of drama around refereeing, penalties, and how and when they were getting called, but for now we're going to put that all aside and just stick to things the way they are in the rulebook. Before we even get to the different types of penalties though, it's important to understand how penalties work in the NHL and hockey in general. In hockey, when a penalty is called, a player who is usually the offending player is sent to what is known as the penalty box, or sometimes referred to as the sin bin. How long they're sent to the penalty box for and what allows them to leave it are both determined by the type of penalty that was assessed, but the entire time that they're in the penalty box, their team will be playing with a man disadvantage, which is known as being on the penalty kill, while the other team is on the power play. Usually, this means that the team on the power play has the normal 5 skaters, while the team on the penalty kill has just 4, with their 5th guy being the one in the penalty box serving the penalty time. Sometimes penalties do stack up and you can get 5-on-3 play, or maybe both teams have a guy in the penalty box and you'll have 4-on-4 play. If it goes too much past that, then usually substitutions are allowed to keep more guys on the ice so you don't end up with just one guy on both sides. But again, it's most often 4-on-5. It's also worth mentioning that somewhat like in football, when a penalty happens, play doesn't necessarily get blown dead right away. Instead, when a referee sees a penalty in hockey, they'll put their arm up in the air and then finally blow the whistle to stop play when one of the players from the team who caused the penalty touches the puck. Oftentimes, play is blown dead pretty quickly after the referee's arm goes up, but there are some cases where the opposing team who's about to go on the power play does maintain possession of the puck for quite a while, and during that time they can pull their goaltender for an extra skater because the other team can't score without touching the puck. The one, we'll say, usual exception to all of that is that if the penalty causes an injury, then play often does get blown dead right away to prevent that player from getting even further injured. And finally, before we do get to those different types of penalties, it is also worth mentioning that when a team is on the penalty kill, icing doesn't get called, so they can shoot the puck as far down the ice as they want, as many times as they want in order to kill the penalty. And if you don't remember or don't know what icing is, I do have a video for that I will leave a link to down in the description. The first type of penalty that we're going to look at is the one that by a vast majority is the most commonly called in the NHL, and that is a minor penalty. Minor penalties are served with a 2-minute stint in the penalty box, served by the player who caused the penalty, or in some rare cases where that was a goaltender or someone on the bench, whether it's a coach or player that caused the penalty, then that team chooses one of their skaters that was on the ice at the time the penalty was called to serve the 2 minutes. So, like we just talked about a little bit ago, when a minor penalty is called, then that player responsible will go to the penalty box for 2 minutes while their team goes on the power kill and the opposing team goes on the power play. Now, with minor penalties, if the team on the power play scores a goal during that 2-minute span, then the penalty is cut short and the player can come out of the penalty box, with that penalty basically having been paid for by the team giving up a goal, which is something that happens roughly 20% of the time where a team does convert on the power play, scoring a goal and cutting the penalty short. This is also known as a power play percentage, the percentage of times that a team on the power play scores a goal, while penalty kill percentage is a team's percentage of preventing a goal being scored during a power play. Again, most penalties in hockey and the NHL fall under this minor penalty category, including the most commonly called ones like tripping, hooking, and roughing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that anytime one of these infractions is called, that it is just a 2-minute minor, as at the discretion of the referee, if an infraction is particularly egregious, they can make it a double minor, which turns into a 4-minute penalty, or even turn it into a major penalty, which we'll get to in just a second. But real quick, with a double minor, that is essentially served as back-to-back 2-minute minor penalties. So if a goal is scored in the first 2 minutes of that 4-minute penalty, then only the remainder of that 2-minute chunk is taken off, and the player will still stay in the penalty box for another 2 minutes. Of course, unless another goal is scored. But if that player's team, who is then on the penalty kill, is able to kill off the first 2 minutes successfully, and then a goal is scored in the last 2 minutes, then just that last 2 minutes comes off like a normal penalty. With that, we'll move on to major penalties. Now, major penalties in a lot of ways are a lot like minor penalties, and in some cases, like I just said, can even be a minor penalty that was turned into a major penalty at the discretion of the referee. Now, usually this only happens if the minor penalty was bad enough to cause an injury, but again, it's up to the referees to decide whether or not they think it's worthy of being turned into a major. It is also worth mentioning here that with the NHL specifically, they did recently over the last couple of years move to using video review to confirm major penalty calls. So if a major penalty is called by a referee on the ice, it will go to video review to confirm that the penalty was worthy of being called a 5-minute major. And I say 5-minute major because the two major differences with this type of penalty versus a minor penalty is, for one, instead of 2 minutes like with a minor, a major penalty incurs a 5-minute stint in the penalty box. And unlike a minor penalty, if a goal is scored during a major penalty, the player does not come out of the penalty box and the penalty is not over until those 5 minutes are up. This does make major penalties pretty substantial because, of course, it does allow the opposing team to score as many times as they can with a man advantage in 5 minutes, which sometimes definitely can be more than once. With major penalties that get called, I would say that it's most common that it's usually a minor penalty that gets turned into a major because of the severity of the infraction, with the exceptions of fighting and boarding that are major penalties regardless of severity. Of course, there are also major penalties that come with a game misconduct. Some major penalties come with a game misconduct attached to them, and other ones, which is the most frequent case, have them tacked on. And in some rare cases, there can be a game misconduct called without a major penalty, but usually there's a major penalty that comes with a game misconduct. With a game misconduct, this is where the player or coach responsible is automatically ejected, regardless of whether that's the goalie, again, a coach, or just any staff on the bench. Again, with these, like a major penalty, when one is called, it goes to review first to make sure that it should be upheld, with the one exception that if a major penalty causes a concussion or neck injury to the opposing player, it is automatically an ejection and game misconduct. Now, if you're most familiar with soccer, unlike there where a red card would cause a team to play a man down, with hockey, if a game misconduct happens and a player gets ejected, they can be substituted for on the ice. Though that player that is substituting for them still would have to go to the penalty box and serve the 5 minutes of that major penalty if there was a major penalty attached. If a goaltender gets the game misconduct and is ejected, then they can substitute their backup goaltender into the game and have another one of the skaters serve that 5-minute penalty. It's also worth keeping track of here that, especially if one of these is handed out early on in the season to a player, if a single player receives more than one game misconduct in a single season, it does result in an automatic suspension. Though, it is also worth noting that a lot of game misconducts can also come with fines and suspensions handed out by the league anyway, but still, it is an automatic suspension regardless of what caused the game misconduct if it is a second one in a single year. Now, one thing that definitely can get confusing is that a game misconduct is different from a normal misconduct penalty. With a normal misconduct penalty, this is a 10-minute infraction where the player has to leave the ice for 10 minutes and can't return until the first stoppage of play after those 10 minutes are up. This is still different though from a minor or a major, where during those 10 minutes their team doesn't have to play with a man disadvantage. Of course, with the exception of the fact that most misconducts come attached to a minor penalty, in which case the 10 minutes of the misconduct and the 2 minutes of the minor penalty are served simultaneously. So for the first 2 minutes of the 10 minutes of the misconduct, they are also serving the 2-minute minor. This is usually served by another player who goes to the penalty box as a substitute that sits out the 2 minutes of the minor penalty and can come back if a goal is scored, while the player with the misconduct stays there until their misconduct 10 minutes are up. Okay, I know that was probably a little confusing and a lot to take in all at once, but basically with a misconduct, these are most frequently used, often after fights, to allow guys to kind of cool down for a little bit, or I guess for 10 minutes after an infraction happens, so that things don't escalate further. It can also visually, while you're watching a game, get a little bit confusing with a game misconduct, because if one of these is handed out with less than 10 minutes left in a period, then often you'll see the player just leave for the locker room, since they're going to have to be gone for the entire rest of that period anyway, and then come back and be in the penalty box at the start of the next period. So that's also something to be aware of. If you do see a guy leaving with, say, 5 minutes left in a period, it doesn't necessarily mean he was ejected. It could just be that it was a misconduct and he'll be in the penalty box at the start of the next period. One other type of penalty that's worth mentioning, though it is pretty rare and you're not likely to see too many of them, is a match penalty. Now, these are pretty similar to a game misconduct, other than the fact that they don't come attached to another type of penalty, and are handed out to a player who is seen as intentionally injuring an opponent. They, like a game misconduct, come with that player being automatically ejected, and another player from that team as a substitute serving a 5-minute penalty. Now, also, like a major penalty or a game misconduct, these do go to review before they're actually upheld, but again, in other ways, they are pretty similar to a game misconduct, but again, with the intentionality aspect, often leading to a suspension or at least a fine. And finally, we'll close things out with penalty shots. Now, a penalty shot is something that's awarded to a player if they were seen to have lost a significant scoring chance as the result of a penalty by the other team. Say, for instance, someone is tripped or hooked by an opposing player while on a breakaway with no one else in front of them. Another way that this could end up getting called is if a player that is not a goalie covers the puck with their hand while in the crease, which is that blue area in front of the goal. Of course, a goaltender can do this, it's part of their job, but if a non-goalie player were to cover the puck with their hand and not like bat it out of the crease or something like that, then that results in a penalty shot. Once called, a penalty shot is taken by either the player who was interfered with, or in the case where it was the result of a player covering the puck with their hand in the crease, then the player that takes it is up to the choice of the team who's taking the penalty shot. The puck is placed at center ice, and the player taking the shot skates towards it, picks it up, and has to maintain possession while moving towards the goal before shooting the puck at the goaltender. And other than that, it's a complete one-on-one situation between the player who's taking the shot and the goaltender. Oh, and sorry, one other thing before we do finish up this video. If you are more into statistics and getting into hockey, penalty minutes for a player are kept track of as a PIM stat, or penalties in minutes. And this is kind of a weird stat, not so much in how it's kept, but in the fact that really for most of hockey's history, it's been looked at as a good thing the more penalty minutes a player has, because it shows that they are a tough physical player that will be hard to play against. It's really only up until recently that a lot of people have started looking at it more as that's just the amount of time that this guy has put his team at a disadvantage, but that's just kind of the growing nature of the sport as a whole. It's also worth noting that when it comes to the statistics, the player that actually got the penalty assessed to them is the one that has those penalty minutes go towards them, and if a player is serving a penalty as a substitute, they don't get any penalty minutes on their stat sheet. But I think that will finally just about do it for this one. Again, there will be a couple of more videos, at least one for minor penalties and one for major penalties, taking a more in-depth look at the specific penalties and what causes them to get called. So if you are interested in those, I hope you will join me for those. Otherwise, if you made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are always buttons for that kind of stuff down below. If you think I missed anything or you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comment section and I'll do my best to get to them. But outside of that, until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other.